Since there's so much focus on the election right now, I want to talk about some ideas that come up in a lesson I like to do with teachers, children, and my undergraduates, which focuses on the issue of gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is all about manipulating the shape of voting districts for your benefit or for the benefit of your party. As a little bit of background, let's talk through how districts even come to exist in the US. So every 10 years, the US conducts a census of the population to know how many people there are overall and in each state. Each state is then allocated a number of representatives. It's pretty much proportional to their population, but because every state gets at least one, it's often off by a little bit. And then each state is responsible for deciding how to cut itself up into equally populated districts. Generally, this has been controlled by the state legislature, and therefore whichever party is in power has an interest in drawing the lines in a way that might help them. There are some states that have started to pass laws that change the way that we do this process, say with an independent commission. But gerrymandering most often comes up when it's controlled by the legislature. So let's talk about an example state, Methlandia. Here we've got 100 precincts. They all have the same number of people in them, and we're going to have 5 representatives to the US House, and therefore we have to figure out how to divide our state up into 5 districts. We have a lot of information about each of these precincts, which is true in today's world where we have a lot of information about how people are likely to vote. So you can see that 60% of our precincts are really heavily Republican and the other 40% are heavily Democrat. We're going to look at 4 different scenarios of how we might cut this state up. So one scenario is maybe the Republicans happen to control the state legislature at the time the census happens, and they decide they want to have as many seats as they can. So a nice clean district might look like this, and you can see it's like a little mini version of the state, and there's 60% Republican precincts and 40% Democrats, and therefore the Republicans are going to win, and they might as well just do this across the whole state. So there are some, and so then they end up with 100% of the seats. So there are some positives about this. Each district, like I said, is a microcosm of the state, and in some sense that seems really fair. Also, one of the ways we often talk about what it means to gerrymander, so the word gerrymander itself comes from the idea that these districts may end up in really weird shapes that are going to help one party over the other, and it comes from the idea that someone thought one of these districts looked kind of like a salamander. So one of the ways we get at that is looking at the amount of perimeter, the perimeter of the district compared to its area. And we want that to be really low. If our districts look kind of like squares or circles, that number is going to be really low. And that's one way to say that our districts are not gerrymandered, because they've not been made into these weird shapes to help one party or the other. And so in fact, this passes that test really well, even though it's not a very fair situation, because we have 0 representation of the minority party. 40% of the state is Democratic, but there's no representation in the US Congress to reflect that idea. All right, now let's say there's another scenario where somehow the Democrats happen to be ahead, and they're the ones who get to draw the map. One of the strategies they're going to use as a minority party is they're going to cram the Republicans into 2 districts and essentially waste a lot of their votes. Right? You only need 51% to win one of these districts, so all those extra Republican votes are essentially wasted, and therefore there are enough Democrats left over that they can win the 3 remaining seats. This is sort of worst case scenario. You have a minority party who actually has the most representation in the Congress. And so it's opposite of the overall will of the population. So that's sort of a worst case scenario that we could come up with. Then there's the case where Incumbents Rule. So maybe the state has passed a law that the Democrats and Republicans have to agree to the map. And they decide, let's just sort of keep things easy for us. We can make 3 really safe Republican seats, and we can also make 2 really safe Democrat seats. And when we do that, both parties are happy. And in fact, we also end up with really proportional representation. This is the one example we're going to look at where the Republicans and the Democrats in the Congress match what's in the population. However, there's some real problems with this, which is that you tend to end up with really extreme candidates. If you're in a Republican district, there's no chance a Democrat's going to win. And what happens is in the primary election is when the real competition happens between sort of more moderate Republicans and more extreme ones and conservative ones, or more moderate Democrats and more extreme Democrats. And also, voters often feel disaffected because what's the point of turning out? Because they know their state is always going to go one way or the other. And if you're in the party that's not well represented in your district, you might feel especially that way. So even though it's very proportional, you have some real problems. And then finally, we might have, say, an independent commission that wants to look at how they could make really competitive races. They want a lot of toss-ups. So this is what a competitive district looks like. It's about half Republican and half Democrat, and we don't really know how the election is going to turn out. So we'll make as many of those as we can, and then we have one district left over that we can't really do anything about and becomes completely Republican. So a positive of this is you have some really competitive districts, and that tends to lead to moderate candidates. A negative is that this is really volatile. You could end up with either party dominating just with a few shifts in either votes or turnout or things like that. Another negative is that even though our districts look kind of nice and squarish, in real life, Democrats tend to live near each other, and that's an increasing trend, and Republicans tend to live near each other, and that's an increasing trend, that we tend to be increasingly separated. And so if you actually wanted to create districts that were toss-ups, they might actually look really gerrymandered and have a really weird shape because people aren't living near each other like they are on this map. All right, so we have Mathlandia, and we have these four scenarios. Republicans can dominate, Democrats can, incumbents can, or we can try to have a toss-up. Now, these top two are openly partisan, right? It's clearly the party working to better its own interests, and that's the gerrymandering that we most often worry and hear about, and that we often try to combat. And the methods we use are sometimes to say either the parties have to agree, in which case we might get something that looks like an incumbent map, or where we hire an independent commission and they might then gerrymander to get the toss-up. But as a reminder, both of these have real problems. The incumbent map might lead to extreme candidates. The toss-up has a lot of volatility, and in fact, making those districts in real life often results in a fair amount of gerrymandering because people with differing political views often don't live near each other. All of these issues really stem from the fact that each district only has one representative, and that makes drawing the districts really hard. So a different kind of solution is to have multi-member districts, where the districts are bigger, but they each have multiple representatives, and then voters get to rank their top choices. And then there's a clear procedure for if you vote for a candidate who gets the least number of votes, we throw those votes out and just look at your second choice instead. That way you can vote for who you really want to and not worry about wasting your votes. And similarly, if you vote for a very popular candidate who gets well over the threshold of the number of votes they need, then we will proportionally redistribute any of their extra votes to people's second choices as needed. And that way, for instance, you could vote for a very popular Republican candidate and extra votes would go to the next Republican candidate, which still reflects your choices and preferences, or similarly with Democratic candidates. And that way you're not throwing your vote away by voting for someone you like. So again, you don't have to try to be strategic in your vote. You can just vote for who you want. If you're interested in these ideas, there's a lot of great information in these two resources, and really a lot of this presentation is based on that. One is CGP Grey has an excellent series called Politics in the Animal Kingdom. It's a series of videos that talks about voting and election systems, and the New York Times has a two-part opinion piece, and the second part in particular, A Congress for Every American, really talks about this idea of multi-member districts and how it could address some of these problems. All right, thanks a lot for listening. Please send me your math questions about this video or anything else at mathymatfk@gmail.com, or leave a comment on this video. And don't forget to like and subscribe.
Math's not a problem with mathematics.